For our COBT viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, Arjun, and a new guy at Veriton, Robert Kester. And we're here with our special guest today, Rob West. When we were thinking about kicking off 2025, we reflected on, who is great at the crystal ball stuff, who is a great friend, who is fun, and who will be an incredible leader of today's discussion. And we thought of course, Rob West. Rob helped us kick it off last year. So this is becoming, Rob, I'm sorry to say this is becoming a bit of a tradition. I don't know if we can rope you into many more years to come, but we love visiting with you. If you don't know Rob, you should. He leads Thunderset Energy. That's his company that he champions and has built piece by piece over the last 5 years. He's a longtime energy analyst and thinker and just a wonderful human being. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Maynard. You're always so kind when you introduce me. Well,
it's easy to do. You're a super kind guy. Well, Mike's going to jump in on the market. I should explain, Robert Kester, Dr. Robert Kester joined us on Monday, January 6th. It was his first day. Robbie's quick history is that he built a company called Rebellion Photonics, which interestingly enough, Rob West was familiar with. Robbie was a Rice PhD. He built the company around methane monitoring technology. The company was highly successful. It was a really cool startup. And Honeywell purchased the company. Rob's now been at Honeywell for about 4 years now and just joined us. He's going to be our partner of technology and innovation. We're delighted to have him, delighted to have this whole squad together. Robert, I think I called you Robert, Rob, and Robbie in the
That's
introduction,
right.
so everybody's really confused. And we've got Rob.
At least there's no other Robs on the call to add to the confusion.
Yeah, you're darn right. We're very versatile. Mike, first show of the year, the markets. What do you got for us?
Yeah, Maynard, I was thinking about it. It's been a while, right? I mean, the last show we had was December 17th, the COPT with Dr. Steve Koonin. So it's been quite a while. And so, I was trying to reflect on maybe what we talked about, and I'm going to use that date, December 17th, to say, okay, let's see where things were then and where things are now. And so, from a bond standpoint, 10-year yield's gone from 4.4% back then to around 4.65% today. As we all know, the Fed cut, the Fed funds raised by 25 basis point, and I think market thinks that there's going to be growth next year, and they also think that the Fed's only going to cut 2 more times sometime in 25, and they may skip early in 2025. So that's what's gotten yields headed up. I'd say from a broader equity market standpoint, it's really interesting is the broader equity markets being the S&P 500 is down about 1% since then. The 2 best performing sectors are energy up around 2% and tech up about 1%. From a crude oil commodity standpoint, crude oil has rallied quite significantly here since that date. It's at around $74 a barrel. That's up $4 a barrel since then. And so a couple things I want to mention. One, time spreads. We haven't talked about crude oil time spreads for quite some time. Time spreads, specifically WTI time spreads, are exploding. They're up quite substantially over the last 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. And it's really kind of difficult to say what that is. Typically, strong time spreads mean a market that's physically getting more tight. And so we'll see if that kind of develops. Second thing I want to mention is that official selling prices from Saudi Arabia. It's the first time they raised their official selling price for Arab Light to Asia in around 3 months. That's kind of telling you the market's a little bit more physically tight than we think. And I think crude oil. I think the thing that we keep talking about quite a bit, or at least people are trying to understand, is you've got a really, really tight global inventory market, which is creating some interesting dialogue. But the second thing is a lot of people think that Trump is going to reinitiate a sanction on Iranian oil early in his presidency, and so I think that's another reason why markets are probably getting a little bit more physically tight. People are expecting that's going to happen. From an energy equity standpoint, a couple things to note. Like I said earlier, energy's up around 2% since then, but a couple things are happening. Arjun will talk about it probably a little bit today, but he's at the Goldman Sachs Energy Conference, so that's ongoing. So we're going to start to hear companies really unveil over the next 2 or 3 weeks what their CapEx spending plans are going to look like for 2025. So I think that's where most investors are focused on. Trudeau resigns yesterday after 9 years. I think that's going to be a net positive for Canadian energy equities. And finally, I think, The one thing we've been talking about probably for the last 6-9 months is just the electricity IPP power segment. Since December 17th, the utilities are up around are pretty flattish, but these IPP and power companies are up another 11 or 12%. Two pieces of news. The first one is that Constellation Energy announced like $1 billion electric services deal with the U.S. government probably at the beginning of the year. That really got things going. And the second thing is, a couple days ago, is Microsoft announced their CapEx budget for 2025 is going to be $80 billion. That's up from roughly $45 billion last year. And it's going to be predominantly geared towards AI, data center build, that stuff of that nature. And I just want to give you a sense of what $80 billion means. That's the combined CapEx next year for Chevron, Shell, Exxon, and Total. So it's a big, big number. And I think one of the things we want to really discuss with Rob is, there's probably going to be hundreds of billions of dollars over the next couple of years spent on AI by these big tech companies. And I think the question is going to be, is that going to be money well spent? Is that going to lower the return on capital employed of these companies? And if that does reduce return on capital employed, does that mean that the multiples of these companies are going lower? So it's something we want to kind of talk about with Rob. So we'll hand it back to you, Maynard.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Arjun, you are at the Goldman Sachs conference, and so it's always great to start the year in Miami with our friends at Goldman. What would you throw in?
We are having a winter storm in New Jersey, so definitely happier to be here in Miami. And I think I found a quiet spot, so please bear with me. But I'm, really excited to be here. I think the conference is off to a good start. There's always an enthusiasm of the start off of the year. We'll see how it persists, whether the energy can maintain this, but sort of good feelings and catching up with people. What I wanted to talk about today is really one of the big themes, and I think it'll tie into our guest, Rob, who's really one of my favorite researchers out there, and this theme of energy scenario normalization. And we wrote about it in our one of our last super spikes, which is, I think we're coming off a period where a very narrow definition of energy transition, one that prioritized climate change as all that matters, had led to a bunch of scenarios that I think were highly unrealistic and were never on track to occur. It has been my motivation to have created Super Spike and to have now joined you, Maynard, and the team here at Veriton to unretire and push back on, and again, that sort of singular narrative that we're only solving for different degrees of warming and net zero scenarios. And I think there's a pragmatism, a reality that is both hitting people in the face, but also reflects the world we live in, where we're going to correctly get back to our hierarchy of needs. Everybody on Earth, to me, without question, solves for reliability and abundance. It's all anyone cares about. You would like it to be affordable and geopolitically secure, but it has to be there first and foremost. And what I say to people is, Arjun, that's all fine, but you're not taking seriously enough the potential negative consequences of climate. My comment back is, if you solve for maximum societal wealth, you will absolutely motivate major new technology development and de facto decarbonization. If you are a country or a region that is short crude oil and you're a billion person scale economy, or even not quite that large, you're going to be highly motivated to figure out abundance, reliability, and geopolitical security without having to buy energy from either hostile countries or maybe even friendly countries. There are friendly countries that have done permit pauses for whatever reason to their allies. And to me, so that is the motivation for new technologies, including things like solar. As an example, once you have your solar installation up and running, you don't have to import the sun from other countries, no matter where those panels come from. So I think there's a real pragmatism and reality coming into these net zero scenarios. Now, I know the IEA gets a lot of slings and arrows for their particular brand of, here are 3 different versions of net zero, one very aggressive, one less aggressive. But it wasn't just them. It was also most of the big oils. And when you think about countries or companies, you have to have realistic scenarios, both to plan your economy, but to also plan your company. Look at the diminution of value of some of the largest oils who pursued some of the most aggressive transition strategies versus those that haven't. There's been some remarkable changes in market caps and performance when you have what I will say too one-sided of a scenario, when they're all just different versions of degrees of warning or net zero. And it brings me to our guest today, who I've had the great pleasure of reading his research, both from a senior advisor role I've had at a private equity firm and now here at Veriton. he is absolutely perhaps my favorite scenario provider. And I know Rob has a business model where I think his research is mainly or just for his clients and those that pay for it, and I respect that. But it is really outstanding work, and I wish more of the world could see it. And while Rob does have various net zero and transition strategies, I've always thought his version of them were always more pragmatic and practical to begin with. And then he also has what I like to call an equity research analyst mindset, which is we're not trying to be ideological about this. We're actually just trying to make the right call. And what that means is when things don't exactly go your way and there's new information, maybe it could be about the pace of electric vehicles, maybe it could be about the timing of coal demand rolling over. He looks at those assumptions and says, what did I get right? And what did I get wrong? It's what I aspire to do. And he does all that. I've never seen him not smile or look happy in his videos. And Maynard, you're the only other person that I meet who is as positive as I think of as Rob is. And again, it is really my honor, my pleasure to be part of this video from here, and is why, Maynard, I really did want to break away from this conference to join this COBT today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, awesome. And Arjun, you basically, that was very kind and absolutely accurate on Rob. And Rob and I both started smiling when you said that. Again, Robert Kester, welcome to Veriton. We're delighted to have you, even though I kind of botched your introduction. See, the deal is, Robert is your professional name, but Robbie is what your friends call you.
It's all right.
And then I was in the Rob zone, so I called you Rob. Rob West, thank you for joining us. I think we're all kind of wondering, how do we jump into something so big and complicated and that's changing so much? You wrote a couple of pieces of late, your themes for 2025, your classic blunders video at the end of 24. You write so much. Maybe I could start in one place, because I think Dr. Koonin was a little bit on this same topic. We all are at some level, which is, it seems like for a while, the world, to Arjun's point, was just going head first into decarbonization at any cost, and we got to get there, and it's got to happen, and that was a unifying model around which the world was seeing energy. And we all know that, or at least many of us feel, that's not the right model. That model has to change, but we don't have a new model yet. We're kind of floundering around a little bit for a unifying energy theme, or at least for the majority. How are you thinking about unifying themes, a way to kind of pull it all together, a way to kind of coalesce people around maybe a new vision of energy? I know that's a whopper to start, but it seems like that's our biggest issue in the world right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think to sum it up, after maybe 5-6 years of doing this and running a research firm focused on energy transition, I'm kind of asking myself, what is energy transition? And I think a lot of us are asking ourselves that question, because it turns out none of us really know. And I think there was a lot of narrative around, like, let's decarbonize the world at any cost. And, like Arjun said, I've been lucky to learn from guys like Arjun over the course of my career and just try and emulate, the brilliant analysts that have been out there. It all comes down to cost. And I did that video on kind of the classic blunders of energy transition. I really kind of concluded the number one blunder is just assuming that what you want to happen is somehow going to defy the laws of economics. So even like decarbonize at any cost, I mean, that's done. But even like decarbonize at some cost, starting to look challenging. I mean, my roadmap to net zero, I needed an average cost of $40 a ton. And, here we are with people saying I won't pay 1 cent more for decarbonization in many of these parts of the world. So I think where we're going to end up is that we are actually going to have a classic energy transition. And what I mean by that is just like the other energy transitions that have happened in the past. So, the first big energy transition was coal in the 19th century. At that time, we call it the kind of energy transition, but we burned about 60% more wood than coal over the 19th century. And the thing was that the coal was new, and it layered it on top of everything else. And it unlocked these amazing new sources of demand like mechanization and railways. And then you had the big energy transition around oil in the 20th century. but we burned as much coal as oil in the 20th century. It's just the oil was new, and it added it on top, and it unlocked amazing new demand in things like plastics and planes and automobiles. And I think we are having an energy transition, which is solar and the things you can do with abundant electricity. And that is going to be the biggest theme of the 21st century. We'll still end up with more energy coming from hydrocarbons than renewables over the course of at least the next 30 years. And it's just that the solar is going to be new, and it's going to unlock amazing new sources of demand. And I'm going to stop there before I start talking about matryoshka brains and the infinite power consumption of AI. But that's where we're going. Is that I really believe what Arjun said earlier. If you give me, I don't know, 50,000 terawatt hours of incremental solar between now and 2050 every year, I think I can deliver you some outcomes that are better for human civilization than just a one-minded focus on climate. And sorry, I got to keep going because I'm in a flow and this is interesting. But I just found a lot of these roadmaps that were out there so depressing. Like, if you think about human progress, human civilization, like, what are we going to do in the next 30 years? And you say, the number one thing we're going to do is we're going to take all the stuff that exists in the world today, and we're going to make it slightly more expensive and cleaner. Okay, good to avert the problems of climate change, but kind of an uninspiring vision for the future of humanity. But if you start telling me about everybody having a near omniscient voice in their ear, or greening 1 billion acres of desert, or becoming an interplanetary species, or whatever, I'm like, that's kind of cool. Like, where's my flying car? And so, I think that giving the world a lot of that extra energy that's mainly going to come from solar as the growth, I think you really could make a case that we can deliver better outcomes for human civilization, including some of the important climate initiatives in that world. And maybe that's what energy transition is. And I promise I won't talk for so long next time you ask me a question.
No, you're here because we want you to talk for so long, Rob, so no problem. Maybe I could just ask you, because we're right in this theme. Arjun referenced how upbeat and positive you are, and you're just on it right now, which is a lot of the forecasting and forward thinking and future thinking that the world has been doing, at least in public, has been around avoiding catastrophe and avoiding terrible things. And we've lost that sense of, it's going to look like the Jetsons. It's going to be amazing. We're going to live on Mars. We're going to have so much money. We're going to do all these great things. Do you have an observation on how call it the Davos dialogue, or the world's leaders, why are they not more positive? Why don't we get up in the morning thinking about all the good things that could happen as opposed to the bad? Is this societal, or is this reacting to the reality of the world? What do you think? I know that's a whopper, but it's a big point, and you're right on it.
Oh, I mean, the media is just an outrage machine, right? Like, that's what sells stories and draws in eyeballs. And I think that there's room for positivity too. And maybe if the media is an outrage machine, then the investment world should be the place where we find the positivity and the visions and the things to get behind and drive forwards.
Well, I was thinking, Arjun, you're at Goldman this time last year. I remember sitting there, and it just wasn't clear maybe where the energy world was going to go. And then you had a lot of these power stocks that were up 300%, and AI exploded. And so there's always something great around the corner. Mike, why don't I let you and Arjun jump in here and see what's on your mind.
Well, Rob, I've got a dozen or so questions I want to ask you in the next 5 minutes. So, I mean, I kind of looked at your 10 themes for 2025, energy themes for 2025. It really got me thinking. But the first question is you started the firm in 2019, and a lot has changed since then. And we've just looked over the last 12 months and maybe the next 12 months. You've got Canadian government is going to change. UK has essentially changed. France is changed. Germany is going to change, and the U.S. has changed leadership. And so a lot of populism, a lot of conservatism is kind of now in governments. How do you think that affects your outlook for the next 5 or 6 years? If anything, it seems like you just said that people are saying, you know what, hell with the basically climate stuff. Let's go ahead and get sustainability, affordable energy. How is that going to change your outlook? Is it changing your outlook? And do you think it will change your outlook over the next 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, I think what all of this is motivated by is a desire for competitiveness. And I think that some of the policies we've put in place, frankly, haven't helped competitiveness. And people feel that. And when people feel like they're not getting what they need, then they vote for a change. And so I think it's not a coincidence that's happened in a lot of developed world countries over the last few years. I did a bit of analysis in 2022, which is when I kind of called the 2024 US election. And it was looking at election results in democratic countries over the last 60 years. I just pulled the data together, and they're 70% correlated between food and energy prices and changes of government in the next election. And it's an amazing chart. The numbers they move in lockstep. And then what you also see is that the kind of politicians who tend to bring prices back down under control tend to remain in government for 10 to 15 years after that. So I think you're probably going to have a wave of policies focused on competitiveness first. And if those policies work, then I think they'll probably run quite a long way.
Rob,
but it makes it hard to like back anything that requires policy support because it's clean. I think that's something that we really need to think hard about.
I guess the point I'm getting at is, one of the points you'd made is like a lot of these subsidies that are out there have probably not been good for technological development. And maybe if we don't have these subsidies and the companies have to basically stand on their own, we're going to get better returns for the companies. You're going to get better companies in general, and it's going to weed out the losers from the winners. And so that's probably a good thing.
Well, I don't know. There's an interesting example. I won't name names, but it's a particular project on the Gulf Coast that is making blue ammonia. And, if you look at this thing with the IRA tax credits, it's like a 40% IRR for the large energy company that happens to be building it. And if you look at it without the IRA tax credits, it's basically, it's a zero. It's a break-even project. And then you kind of start thinking, well, is that really adding any value to society other than kind of a large transfer of capital from the government to a large energy company that happens to be building clean ammonia in a world that is still going to be, emitting somewhere between 30 and 50 billion tons a year of CO2 every year between now and 2050. And I think that, you could look at it and say, it's definitely higher cost. CO2 abatement costs about $100 a ton. It's definitely absorbing billions of dollars that could have gone elsewhere. It's definitely got a 30% energy penalty versus not CO2 abating the thing. And it's probably taking jobs in the United States that could go to like things that people really want to pay for without subsidies, and sucking them in and pulling them into this big project. And if I've got the read of the administration coming in, kind of the read is don't do that. And that's why I know there's been a lot of talk about, a lot of the IRA dollars end up going to red states, and so they won't get scaled back. But I guess, we're in the business of making predictions, and I might kind of go out on a limb and make the prediction that people will be surprised by how much of the IRA, really does get scaled back.
Rob, I want to follow up on sort of thinking through scenarios. So I think on the one hand, when I look back at the net zero scenarios, the idea that net zero could be thought of as an aspiration, like here's an environmental objective, how do we think about aspirationally to get there? That aspect of it never really bothered me. And we could debate 2050 or whether some other decade would have been more appropriate. I think it's when those became de facto treated as scenarios, or we're on this path or what have you, that some issues and some challenges arose. I think the flip side of that is simply, if we're looking at an aspirational environment that reflects society's basic desires, to me, it is that everyone will someday be energy rich. And I use the example, I'm 55 years old. In my lifetime, we've seen South Korea go from poor to middle income to rich. Prior to that, Japan, after World War II, devastated to by 1990, buying properties in Rockefeller Center and being a rich country again. So it is entirely possible within 50 years to go from poor to rich. We can debate the timing of that, certainly for a whole bunch of Asian and African and Latin American countries. But how is that not the aspiration? And can we not come up with similar scenarios to try to solve for that? Because I firmly believe when you do that, you're going to do a heck of a lot of solar to try and avoid importing other forms of energy if you don't have it. You're going to try and crack the code on different forms of electrification. We don't know exactly the timing of these things. And the in-between point is, I think most scenarios will use some sort of IMF GDP forecast going out to 2050 or some year. And I understand why one would use that. But to me, the equivalent to net zero would be the everyone someday is, I use the term energy rich, as our alternative aspiration. And then in between, we have these mixtures of GDP and timings and so forth. I just have to get your reaction to that alternative scenario to net zero, which I firmly believe will lead us on a better track to meet all of our objectives: geopolitics, affordability, and ultimately the environment as well.
And it's tough because nobody really knows. But I want to caveat what I say, like predicting the future. But yeah, I think my gut is kind of with you that if you have an energy transition outlook that is basically requires everybody to thrift how much energy they use, that's never going to fly. And you know, I kind of share your total mystification that was like seriously being advocated for. You know, with just basic not doing of maths. You know, the idea that there's 4 billion people in the world who use 90% less energy per capita than the wealthiest billion. And like the solution of like human prosperity is that by 2050, they only use 80% less, not 90% less. And, you know, it's like, guys, I think, you know, you've seen that being wrong every year. And, you know, maybe the closest place you've seen it is coal forecasts. But, you know, coal's going to peak this year. And then in 5 of the last 6 years, you know, those numbers have been revised upwards. So, you know, that there was a forecast famously like, that global coal consumption had peaked in 2018 and it was meant to be 7.7 billion tons a year. And that was going to be the all-time peak. And last year it was 8.9 billion tons. And, you know, what's a billion tons of coal per year between friends? Well, it's an entire Saudi Arabia of oil production that was just in the gap of upwards revisions to forecasts. So I don't know. There's lots of ways to think about net zero from here. And I think the one that has really been sticking in my mind, I don't know whether I should be using this analogy, but I think about it like the war on terror. I mean, it's like, yeah, the Taliban were really bad guys. September 11 was an awful, awful thing, but it turns out you can throw $5 trillion at putting boots on the ground in Afghanistan and just actually not solve the problem. And I think that with some of these climate roadmaps, we were actually heading for a similar thing, which was this kind of worst of all worlds, which was to deny energy to billions of people on planet Earth, spend trillions of dollars trying to solve this problem, and then not actually even solve the problem. And I think if you've been, you know, following this for 5 years and revising your numbers, your coal numbers up every year for 5 years, it's like the Homer Simpson moment. It dawns on you and you think, maybe what we're doing is not working. And that is what opens the door to the idea of maybe we need to try something else. And I guess that's kind of what you're getting at with your question. And the idea is, if we are going to try something else, what do we try and how do we bring people along and make better outcomes for everybody, including the very real need to, you know, deal with changing climate?
I will just use China as my example, where they wanted to go from poor to rich. They're at the middle income status now, and they burned a heck of a lot of coal and they brought a lot of crude oil and there's some natural gas in there. But they're now at a point where importing 12 million barrels a day of crude oil, they've completely freaked out that we're barely middle income as a country. And we still have 1.4 billion people who are, you know, we don't simply getting to Thailand's oil penetration would double our crude exports, let alone if we got to Europe, let alone if we got to South Korea and these other places. And so you're seeing them transition on that, right? And so so I look at India, I look at these other places. To me, becoming rich is the pathway to motivating transition, as opposed to solving for the carbon emissions.
I mean, I like that, but I also wouldn't forget in the developed world, you know, in a sense, like we've gone from, you know, rich to Meh. I mean, I was grumbling about this yesterday. In our apartment, in our district where I live, we have biogas recycling. So we have a separate bin, and I put the wrong bag in the bin, and then I had to go and root through my rotting food garbage to put it in the bio recycling bin, which my wife is very, very rigid about. She's the queen of recycling in our household. And
we have a New York apartment where you have to do the same thing. You have to weed out the garbage you incorrectly placed in the wrong bin. Totally the same thing here.
But there's something about rooting around in your own. There's something about rooting around in your own garbage to generate biogas where you feel not entirely energy rich. And just the other example I was going to give you was one of my favorite examples of this, which was growing up in Southwest London in the 1990s. My first word was, I'm told, Tontor, which was when Concorde would fly overhead. And, I just find it amazing. Like, you could get from New York to London in 3.5 hours in, the early years of my life. And, now the fastest time you can do that takes twice as long. And that makes us like the first generation in history where travel times have actually worsened one generation on the next. And so I think there is this sort of slightly scary thing going on in the developed world. Like, it's great to be alive today. The world is a pretty good place to be, but we have kind of gone from energy rich to energy slightly less rich in some ways in the developed world. I know Maynard wanted to say something on that.
No, I just loved the image of you digging around in the trash cans. It reminds me when you're in California. When you're in California, you want to throw something away. There's like 6 choices on where you're going to, put it. So it's a bit of a tax.
And of course, there should be the, efficient recycling of different materials. But in my utopian vision of civilization, it's done by an AI bot at the landfill center, not by me rooting through my garbage. And so, I did this thing. I think one of the big questions, like Mike alluded to this, is AI becoming a bubble? Are we going to find that all these things that ripped last year, it turns out that actually there wasn't that demand for AI and it's going to all kind of collapse like a warm Easter egg. So I'm going to go the other way. And the way I would go the other way is I was thinking over Christmas, in the sort of moments of downtime, can I think of 100 uses of AI in the space of 3 hours? And I just sort of sat down with a pen and paper, and it was pretty easy. You start thinking of, I would quite like a autonomous bot to sort my garbage for me so I don't root around through the trash. And just the more you look, the more you find. So there is this entire genre of sci-fi involving what's called Dyson spheres and Matryoshka brains. And the idea is that civilizations around the universe inevitably progress to the point where they capture all of the energy from their star in order to feed compute, and then solve all the problems needed for civilization in that galaxy or the solar system. And I actually sort of say it as a joke, but if you give me infinite AI compute, I'm telling you, you could just change absolutely every value chain. And you don't really think about it until you write the research note about why do we leak 6% of the gas that goes into that leaky gas distribution network? Or why can't we align our solar modules perfectly with the sun 24 hours a day, 365 days a year? And you sort of write those notes and you just, AI is going to be really good at that.
Well, we're right here in it. I had some things in my head to go next to, but we're in the AI moment. Robert, that's going to be, it's one of your passions. It's one of the things you're going to lead at Veriton is the AI use case. Let me ask you to jump in and let's touch on AI while we're on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So as the tech guy, obviously I have a question for you around that. So when you think about AI, obviously a lot of people are concerned about the energy that's required to support these data centers and whatnot. But I think you also highlighted, almost looked like you had a MAT curve in one of your analysis where you looked at how AI can actually help with the energy transition and have a positive, return on energy. And so I just wanted to get some of your thought around there? What are some of the applications or ways that you see that AI can help with the energy transition?
I mean, it's just, there's so many and it's so hard to count them all. I made a joke last year after I burned a piece of toast that like somebody should invent an AI toaster. And, then you wouldn't waste energy burning your toast. And then I actually looked and last year, someone actually has developed an AI enabled toaster and it's like on the market. So
That's hilarious.
There is the kind of whole efficiency angle, which is everything from your autonomous vehicle to your AI toaster. But the biggest one is in materials value chains, right? 40% of all the energy in the world is used to make materials. And I love that example of aluminium, which used to be, one of the most difficult metals in the world to smelt. So rare and costly that Napoleon had his cutlery made out of it, and they put it at the top of the Washington Monument as a symbol of America's industrial greatness. And then they invented the Hall-Héroult process, where it turns out you don't need to smelt aluminium. You can electrowin it. You need to just dissolve it in molten cryolite at 980 degrees and then like centigrade and then pass a current through the stuff. And, it went from a value chain that was like 4% efficient to one that's now 60% efficient. And now aluminium is so cheap that, you can wrap your sandwiches in the stuff. And I think there are going to be a lot of other examples like that. The average materials value chain is about 20% efficient. And it's just, we haven't found our cryolite. We haven't found our electrowinning solvent or our catalyst or our metal organic framework. And, everybody's going to leave this podcast thinking Rob's lost his marbles and become a mad scientist. But like DAC, take DAC as an example. The DAC process on the market today, direct air capture, it's like 2,500 kilowatt hours a ton of energy needed per ton of CO2 that you take out. The thermodynamic minimum is about 120 kilowatt hours per ton. And, so it's like over 95% better than the best stuff out there on the market today. And it's probably going to be a metal organic framework. And we're probably going to find it using AI. If it's out there, that's how we're going to find it. And you think about that, and you think about a world of infinite solar energy where you just energize a little porous framework molecule and it absorbs CO2, and then you hit it with a reverse voltage and it gives it up again. And I think what you should do with it is you should feed that CO2 into a mineralization value chain, and then you can recreate where you can put all the CO2 you want out of the atmosphere to make a useful material that you can either use for construction or, even cooler, do it in coastal regions and build up like coastal defenses against climate change, because it's going to happen by growing like a carbonate platform as a reef or a coastal break. And it's like, back to Arjun's point, give me infinite energy and infinite conceptual science, and I can give you better human outcomes than, the like, let's all root through our garbage and drive at 50 miles an hour scenario.
Oh, this is great. We definitely have to have Rob on our roundtable to be thinking of these use cases. This was awesome.
Hey, Rob,
Be warned. I mean, it'll be a long roundtable session.
A really long table.
That's right.
There's so many places we could go with this, Rob. I was thinking maybe just to shift gears a hair. I think most people know you're in Estonia. I was thinking back on our history. We actually had you on the COBT to start the year in 2022, which was our last one ever at TPH. So you have a long history of sitting in this pole position. But pretty early in our discussions with you, Estonia and its geopolitical position, and then of course we have the war between Russia and Ukraine, and more recently there's been these things where sabotage of cables, happening. I guess from Finland to Estonia. There's things happening that are a little disturbing. Can you give us sort of the geopolitical risk assessment from Tallinn, like how you're feeling about the war and the things happening that seem to be connected to the war?
Yeah, I mean, it's only taken 3 and a bit years of living here, but as you say, I've become a paranoid Northeastern European. So, that has happened. I mean, I'm here because I find the story of this country really inspiring. And, my wife, who is from Estonia, like we could have lived anywhere, like the US, Europe, the UK. But just the story of what people went through under Soviet occupation for 50 years, and how the country just came from, having a GDP per capita about $3,000. It's like an African country, to, now I think higher GDP per capita than Spain. It's just all this development in the last 30 years of people who were hungry and wanted to build good institutions and build cool companies and cool technologies and more unicorns per capita than any other place in the world. And I find that whole thing just so inspiring. So it's really been enriching to me in my life to be here, but it's scary. It's really scary what's going on in the world. And I think that it's something that we need to take really seriously when we talk about good human outcomes, for the future. And I think one thing that got forgotten amidst the frenzy towards climate and the kind of, competitiveness, does that really matter? Is that if you can't defend your way of life, then, very literally, you cannot defend your way of life. And I think that there's a lot in that around where policy is heading towards getting more competitive, because, there are bad actors in the world who don't necessarily want the West to flourish and to do well. And if we can't defend our way of life, then we can't defend our way of life. So I don't know what more is kind of useful to say about that. I hope that's okay as an answer.
Well, it is, but I think or maybe if you could add anything, which is like I referenced this example of the sabotage of the cables and things like that. Like, are you feeling? Is it feeling in Estonia less secure than it was a year ago or so in terms of the conflict potentially widening?
I don't think it's feeling less secure. I think that in this part of the world, there's always been a consciousness that, we're an embarrassment, right, for Russia. Like the fact that Estonia and other Baltic countries and Poland to some extent, clothed themselves free. Is that a word? I've just made it a word. And had like such economic development while Russia remained quite stagnant in terms of cost of living and standards of living for people. Is something that there's always been this kind of like jab in the side, risk of sabotage. But we've had this across the developed world for years. I mean, like I was living in the UK when the Salisbury nerve agent attacks occurred. And I think, one perspective that I hear that I actually have some time for is somebody said to me, actually in the West, we are already at war. We just choose not to call it that because of the implications. That kind of resonated with me. I mean, for anybody who's listening who doesn't know this story, there have been a series of interconnector cables and power lines and fiber optic lines that have mysteriously been severed. And they stop working, and then people go down and like, well, what happened? Why is that line not working anymore? And you can see that like a ship has deliberately dragged an anchor over it. And it looks like the latest of that was quite clearly linked to the Russian shadow fleet. And weirdly, interestingly, something very similar happened with some fiber optic cables connected to Taiwan just in the last week. So it kind of is this playbook of like, as they call it, hybrid attacks, which is what you call it when you don't want to call it an act of war, because if you did, you'd have to invoke NATO Article 5, and then, things would get quite hairy. And I think what you have is sort of testing of the waters of how far can you push these attacks. And so it'll be important to see what the developed world does to stand up to that. And, is a slap on the wrist going to be enough? Well, back to coal forecasts. It hasn't worked previously. So I think, to your question, Maynard, some people I speak to here say things are going to be safer under the new US administration. It's going to be a no-nonsense thing. And Trump is a strong man, and it takes a strong man to stand up to a strong man. And some people say that, he's going to make threats towards NATO. And I think with all these things, the right answer is somewhere in the middle, which is my way of saying I don't know. Just carry on the best that you can.
This is why it's so fun to talk to you, Rob. We do
But
have so many things we could talk about.
But where do you go with that, right? Like, I think what's interesting is where you go with that is what does it mean for energy markets this year? And I can think of like two kind of wild card situations worth talking about. One is, I said in a research note last year that the US amazingly had gone from like 80% self-sufficient in the time of George W. Bush to 100% self-sufficient in energy today. It's actually not true. About 30% of the US's enriched uranium is still imported from Russia. And it's just an interesting scenario of what if like that supply of enriched uranium dried up suddenly, and could it mean upside for natural gas in a kind of Russia conflict scenario? And then the other one is China. Like, China is now 70 to 90% of all solar modules, EVs, and a bit less for wind, the lower end of that range. And it's just like, it can imagine an energy scenario where for some reason the West could no longer import wind, solar, or electric vehicle batteries from China. And it would be this like almighty shift in the energy landscape where you get less renewables, less EVs, and, a whole new oil cycle in the West. And actually, you make these comments about the cable, and I guess what's interesting about that is the cutting of the cables prove that these risks are real. Everybody puts them in their outlook scenarios like a tail risk. Oh, what if China tariffs got crazy and we stopped getting access to Chinese solar in the West? But, they are real risks that we should be talking about, and they deserve some non-zero weighting in our kind of valuations and thoughts about what's going to happen in energy this year.
I was just thinking on one of the great and entertaining but scary scenarios you have in your outlook for the year is the, I believe you call it the FU recession.
Yeah.
And we're kind of in and around the FU recession. You might,
right.
I might ask you to talk a little bit about that one. You make some great comments.
Well, I think we're going to have definitely a lot of bluster around trade. And the idea of the FU recession is that people just decide not to trade with each other anymore. And, take LNG. Like, if I've built LNG facilities and I can't sell them to LNG importing countries because we have some kind of trade embargo, that's a big disruption. And so all of these value chains could have big disruptions as part of this. And I think that what you actually, LNG was a bad example, because what you should own in a world of volatility and possible disruptions is the stuff that specifically helps with flexibility. So being able to move gas anywhere on the water to whoever needs it, actually, there's more and more value of that in a volatile world. So I think this year I don't necessarily want to be long energy, but I want to be long volatility.
So does that, when you think about enterprises that can thrive in a world of volatility and unpredictability, is it better to core up and make sure all of your operations are in the safest possible place on the planet, or is it better to be a multinational with the ability to move to anywhere where it's good or bad? Or maybe we're going towards both models. We're going to get Texas companies coupled with global juggernauts, and I'm just using Texas.
Oh man, you're so blessed in Texas. I just, whenever I run grid analysis and I look at like what is the wholesale pricing on ERCOT, I always have to check the numbers. I can't believe they're that low. That's what electricity costs in your part of the world. I actually figured out last year that Texas has more hydrogen pipelines than the Baltic nations have 2-lane highways. Like, it's crazy the amount of infrastructure you have, and it all forms this incredible rich ecosystem. And that boom, I think, is just going to continue.
Well, we're getting towards the top of the hour. Mike, any last thoughts on your mind?
Yeah, I mean, that last point you made on basically infrastructure midstream, I mean, that's one of your points that you made. We talked earlier about Microsoft spending $80 billion, and it's going to be hundreds of billions of dollars, and are they really going to get returns there? But one of the points you also made is that the infrastructure, the guys provide that energy, are going to be the beneficiaries. And if you look this year, yeah, some of these IPP companies are up 200 or 300%, but utilities, electric utilities did very well because, as we've classified it, it's going to be a growth industry over the next 5 or 6 years, regardless if there's a recession or not. I think my question for you is, you talked about midstream variability. And if you look at some of these midstream natural gas companies in the US, they're some of the best performers after years of doing nothing. Do you think that sort of continues here? Because it does seem like the returns for the big technology stocks, we don't know what the returns are going to look like. So return on capital employed could be coming lower. But the midstream companies, the electric utilities, I sense that the return on capital employed is going to be going higher, which means valuation expansion. Maybe some thoughts on the variability thing that you talked about, and maybe some of that as well from an investor standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, it's the biggest bottleneck in the world, is moving the energy from where it's created to where it's needed. And there are some interesting ways of bypassing that bottleneck, but bottleneck it remains. I mean, grid capex running at about $300 billion a year, went up to $400 billion last year, has to hit $500 billion this year in my numbers just to keep up with what we need. And, every year, despite that increase, we get further and further behind. So, if you just think about those markets in supply demand, we've gone from, the grid in the developed world going sideways for 20 years to, now we have a couple of percentage points of growth. Like global electricity demand growth has gone from 2% a year to about 5% a year. It's huge. And so, on top of that, you have the second theme, which is the volatility. Wind and solar, are clearly volatile generation sources, and you can add it up and measure this, going through the hour by hour power prices on different regions globally. I've got, 7 countries or regions measured here, and the volatility of power grids has trebled in the last decade, as measured by the standard deviation of hours. And that again benefits people who have flexibility, because, if prices fall to zero, cool, I don't have to sell to you. But if prices go to, $1,000 a megawatt hour and I've got some spare capacity, that's very valuable. And the way all of these markets look is that, the price functions are log normally distributed, which means that they're massively asymmetrical to the upside. Like prices can't really go that far below zero, but they can go a long way up until somebody will switch off the demand. And that's why, the more volatile our energy system gets, there's more value in the midstream, the trading, the marketing. And I just think that's such an interesting place to be.
Well, Rob, I hate to say goodbye, but we're getting close to an hour. One thought, and Arjun referenced it, he was talking about your business, the business of Thunderset Energy, and you research things and people consume it and love it. But what I've always loved about it is, the analogy is you don't try to make the food that you think people will buy. You make the food that you want to consume, and if people want to buy it, that's great. Like you're thinking about what you're thinking about, and if people are interested, that's great. What would surprise us as you think about the year or 2 or 3 ahead of us? What's a variable or a question or a technology that you kind of have on your radar as like, hey, we're not talking enough about that, or that could be a mystery factor, or that's an unknown that people don't have on their radar that they should? Like, is there anything like that you could kind of tease us with?
Well, I've got a lot of scars in the last 5 years from writing research notes about technologies. And generally, I've been tracking this. It takes about 15 years to go from something that's a cool idea in the lab to something that works in the real world. And 20% of those companies kind of go under every year. So, getting excited about a new technology, the hurdle is going up and up and up for me. So I've got so many research notes I've written saying this is right at the cusp of commercialization. And I sort of look back at them and feel a bit embarrassed. So the ones that are different, interestingly, they're all semiconductor technologies. It's why, kind of bring it back to what we were saying at the beginning. I think that, the third great energy transition is the energy transition of semiconductors. And it's solar as a way of producing energy, which is a semiconductor technology. It's AI as a way of consuming energy, which is a semiconductor technology. And if I was going to get excited, I would get excited about other semiconductor technologies. So the one I will give you to answer your question is called the Seebeck effect, and it's pretty cool. So you know how solar, you take incoming electromagnetic radiation called light, and it hits this bit of silicon, and boom, it promotes these electrons into the conduction band, and then you make energy. Well, the Seebeck effect is exactly the same, but for heat, for temperature. So anywhere that there's a temperature difference, these thermoelectric semiconductors just take the temperature difference, and in a solid state device, they just convert it into a direct current. And today we have them. It's stuff like cadmium telluride. It's not very efficient. But if you go back, solar 20 years ago was 5% efficient. And today it's 25% efficient, and we'll get to 50% efficient. And if I was going to bet on one thing that nobody talks about that I think will actually kind of happen and change the world, it will be low cost, highly efficient thermoelectrics, where you can take a temperature difference everywhere and you can turn it back into direct current. So, it's the exhaust pipe of your car. You just take all the waste heat and boom, it's now electricity. It's the heat leaking out of your house. Well, your house can self-generate electricity from the way you're heating it. In Estonia in the winter, not in Texas in the summer. And so it's all of that industrial heat. But okay, you have a big reactor running at 900 degrees centigrade, fit it with thermoelectrics on the outside, and you'll take all that waste heat, and instead of just going out into the atmosphere, it'll become electricity with no moving parts at very low cost. And that is something that I think is cool, that could change the world. There's a semiconductor technology that is why I can talk about it and be excited about it and not worry that awesome. I'm barking up the wrong tree.
No, that's fantastic. Well, as we wrap up, anything personally you're going to do this year, like any adventures or anything you'd share about what's on your radar for Rob West outside of work? You always come up with great things that you're up to.
This year, I'm more excited than I've ever been about just figuring out what's happening in the world of energy. And, I think this is going to be the biggest year of change in everybody's energy outlook and everybody's energy perception. And any shred of spare time that I have, it probably makes me sound like a huge loser, but it's what I like doing and thinking about. I'd like to get my 10K time on the rowing machine below 38 minutes. But
okay,
otherwise,
there you go. There you go. That's what we were looking for.
Yeah. Otherwise, I'm mainly nerding out over here.
That's fantastic.
You're always so interesting to talk to and full of fantastic questions. I just want to say I'm so grateful to get to kick off your year. The other thing I'll say to flatter you is I became a parent last year, and as a result, I spent a lot of time listening to podcasts. I'm bouncing a baby, I'm listening to a podcast. And I just always, when I put on the Veritum podcast and I hear you guys, it just puts a smile on my face when I'm tired. And so I just want to say thank you for that. It's always interesting. I love being part of your community, and thank you for enriching my podcast making and listening for many years past and many years to come.
You're fantastic. We're honored to have you as a friend. And thinking out loud, a personal goal for me is I want to come back and see you in Tallinn.
Oh yeah, please do.
That was the best visit.
But I've been thinking of doing a little energy conference, mainly like just invite some friends, rent out an old manor house, and just have like a great dinner and a couple of great energy discussions. And I'm actually wondering whether we should do that.
Okay,
Anyway, that's
now-
something for another time.
No, now we're teasing the world with this thing. Just text me the dates and I'm there, Rob.
All right.
All right.
Nice.
Well,
Good.
thank you, Rob. And thanks, everybody. And let's have a fantastic 2025. Let's all nerd out on energy this year.